Welcome to Pastor. I'm Dave Stone. Thanks so much for taking time to join us. A lot of things you could be doing. We're honored that you would join us. Today is going to be a great day. We're going to be talking with someone who knows an awful lot about two things that every Christian should love, and that is evangelism and Easter. This is the Reese's Cup episode, all right? We've got peanut butter and we've got chocolate. We got two great things, and you're going to love the conversation. Let me remind you, if you have not listened to any of our preview episodes, go back, listen to Ted Cunningham's episode, listen to Kyle Idemann's, listen to the one that I did on the heart behind Pastor to Pastor. It's less than 10 minutes long. It will let you know where it is that we're going on this journey. Well, let me tell you a little bit about today's guest. His name is Lee Strobel, and I know you're going to love Lee. If you aren't acquainted with him, this guy has authored over 50 books, so you probably know the name. He graduated from Yale. In addition to that, he was an award-winning investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune. That's where everything began to turn in his life, because he was a very devout atheist, did not believe in God, but his wife, Leslie, found Christ, and Lee went on a mission to disprove Christianity, and that's where everything changed. He became a Christ follower. He became a believer. He went into the ministry. He worked on great churches like Willow Creek, Saddleback, the Woodlands Church. As I mentioned, he's probably best known for being an author, books like The Case for Christ. His newest book just came out, Seeing the Supernatural. He has an entire chapter devoted to Easter. It will be a big help to you as you prepare for Easter in your lessons, Bible study groups, and in preaching. And right now, let me just invite you to fasten your seatbelt and join me as we listen in on this conversation with Lee Strobel. Thank you so much for joining us, Lee.
I'm so honored to be here. By the way, your name came up the other day. Actually, it was a while back. With my wife and I were at lunch in Texas.
Oh, really?
And the waiter was a really nice guy. So we thought, well, we should tell him about Jesus, you know. So we tried to get into a spiritual conversation. He kind of stopped and said, you know what, I'm already a Christian. I said, oh, that's great. How did you become a Christian? He said, a guy named Dave Stone led me to the Lord.
Oh, my word.
I know. So I thought, I know Dave.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well,
he was formerly from Kentucky, where you were a pastor, and yep.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
That was so cool.
You wonder if seeds that have been scattered sometimes.
You never know
what soil they may have fallen on.
Yeah, he was impressed. I knew you.
If he only would have known who he was serving and waiting on. Well, I want to jump right in.
Yeah.
Because we have Christian leaders who are listening to this, and they are all involved in a variety of different ways of serving. And one of the things that I've noticed is that oftentimes Christian pastors will tend to say, well, I'm just really not gifted when it comes to evangelism, and that's not my gifting. Somebody else has that gift, or they'll say, I'm not an extrovert, or I don't have all the answers. I came to faith later in life.
Yeah.
That's the preacher's job, or that's somebody else's job. Yeah. And if they're the preacher, then they'll say, well, I'm just not gifted in that area.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Sometimes if you're a pastor or a church leader and you're not gifted in evangelism, that's the very best scenario. And the reason I say that is if you're one of these guys who just it flows out of you, you're an extrovert, you're leading people to Christ all the time, then people in the church look at you and go, oh, that's Pastor Jim. He's got that gift. He can do that. That's not me. I can't do that. But if Pastor Jim gets up and says, this is really hard for me. I know I need to be sharing my faith, but that doesn't come naturally to me. And everybody listening is going, yeah, me too.
My heart's beating faster too.
Exactly. Yeah. So sometimes it's great that when you're not gifted in terms of evangelism, to be able to
that can be an asset.
It can be an asset. Yeah.
I know you've worked with some churches of all different sizes
Yeah.
when it comes to evangelism. What are some different tips that you could give to church leaders?
Well, we have a 6-stage process that Mark Middleberg and I came up with years ago that Mark's written about in his book, Contagious Church. And any church that follows it, because it's biblical, we just see an explosion of evangelism take place.
Really?
I'll go through the 6 steps real quickly. First step is that the leaders of the church must own and model the value that lost people matter to God. So whether it's your gift or not, you've got to embody the value of evangelism for the church. The senior pastor is going to kind of set the high water mark of how evangelistic that church is going to be. And so that means there's some things we can do. We can talk about that later if you'd like. When we don't feel particularly engaged with evangelism and we've kind of lost that passion a bit, to regain that. But people, values are caught, they're not taught. And so people watch you, and when you as a senior leader model this evangelism value in one way or the other, people pick up on that. Second step is you must instill that value into the congregation. You do that by preaching. You do it by informal conversations. I remember once I was at a church, on a church staff, and we were in a team meeting, and the pastor came in. He was all excited. And we said, "Hey, what's going on?" He said, "Oh, well, I stop every morning on the way to church at the corner bakery, and I buy a blueberry muffin. And because I go there every day, I got to know the owner, and we're kind of friends. And he tells me about his family and everything. And today, I invited him to come to church at Easter, and he said yes."
Wow.
And so that kind of informal instilling of it, because it caused me to say to myself, who am I reaching out to?
Yeah.
What business am I patronizing over and over to build a relationship, to invite someone, and so forth? So he didn't have to preach at me, but he's instilling that value. Third stage is, I think any church, small or large, needs an evangelism point person who's going to lead the evangelism charge of the church. The senior pastor can't do it all. You've got a lot of values to uphold and to teach on. You can teach a series on evangelism, and the evangelism fervor of the congregation will go up, but then you got to move on to something else, and then it goes down.
Sure.
You need someone, and in a small church is a volunteer, in a large church is a staff member, it could be a part-time person, that is their role, is to lay awake late at night praying and dreaming and scheming. How are we going to reach this community for Christ?
Do you want that person to be gifted in evangelism?
I want that person to be gifted in leadership. That's the key. What you don't want is Joe Evangelist that likes to stand on a street corner with a bullhorn, wear a bad sports coat, because people won't gravitate to that. I want a leader who is passionate about reaching the community for Christ, whether they're gifted or not. That's their passion, and he can rally people. The fourth step is that 100% of the congregation needs to be trained how to naturally and effectively share their faith. And that's a role of your point person. He's going to teach that in seminars repeatedly. You're going to do some series on it from the pulpit and so forth. But everybody needs to be taught, and both words are important. Naturally share your faith. We don't all have to do it the same way. We don't all have to be extroverted. There are 6 different styles biblically of sharing your faith, and one of those styles is going to sync up with everybody. So we want to teach people how to be themselves and share their faith in a natural way, in an effective way. So we want to train them.
I love that, because in Contagious Christianity, that's talked about a whole lot.
Yes.
And that slick salesperson, no one wants an evangelist who has an answer for everything.
Right.
I like it when the person says, "Oh, that's a great question. I don't know the answer, but I'll try to find out for you."
Yeah, or let's find out together. Let's read a book together.
And then they come back,
Exactly.
or you study something together. That person is much more winsome than the person who, this is how it is, and I've got an answer for everything.
We had a woman in our church named Julie, was a housewife and very sweet woman, great at building one-on-one friendships, but she was very introverted. And she never shared her faith because she thought, I got to stand on the street corner with a bullhorn. That's not me.
Sure.
Well, we showed her, no. You can have a relational style, build friendships, and we'll teach you how through those friendships to share your faith in Jesus. So we taught her that, and in that first year, Julie led 16 people to faith in Christ. in that first year of lunch. She's been doing it ever since. You know, we don't. You don't have to do it like me. I don't have to do it like you. We just all need to do it in some way that syncs up with how God created us. And then the fifth step is there are about 1% of a congregation these days. The number has gone down in recent years, according to Barna. But about 1% of a congregation has a gift in evangelism, a spiritual gifts. Now, some people dispute whether evangelism is really a spiritual gift, but they are. God uses them in an extraordinary way to lead people to faith. We all know somebody like that. Well, it's down to 1% of a church. So if you're in a church of 200, you probably have 2 people in your church that are, God just uses them repeatedly. They just have this gear of leading people to faith. Well, regardless of how many people you have, we say, let them stay in whatever ministry they serve at the church, whether it's children's ministries, whether it's student ministries, whether it's women's ministries, whatever. Draw them together periodically, encourage them, do special training, and then send them back into those ministries in the church to be embers of brightness that can shine brightly in terms of evangelism in each of those areas of the church. So we want to build into those who are especially gifted. And then the sixth stage is to do evangelistic outreach and ministries in the church. And this can range anything from food pantries, where you don't just provide food to people who are hungry, but you also share the gospel of Jesus. It could be a debate that you have between an atheist and a Christian on the resurrection. A variety of things. You could do a golf training thing with a professional golf player who also is a Christian, can share his testimony as part of that. Whatever it is, small groups for non-believers, those are huge and very effective. Those are, oh my goodness, just dynamite these days. We find at least 80% of people who join these groups as a non-believer end up coming to faith in Christ. 80%. Yeah. So
we used to do a Bible study where we had 1/3 strong Christians, 1/3 baby Christians, and 1/3 non-Christians. And I can't tell you how exciting it was every Wednesday night.
Yeah.
Because we never knew what God was going to do.
Yeah.
And it might be the baby Christian who is helping the non-Christian come along and take that next step.
I love that.
But it was so much fun.
There's a guy named Gary Poole. I don't know if you know Gary, 2 Hours on Gary.
Yeah.
He's a expert on how to do these kind of groups. And we brought him into our church and said, Gary, go nuts, start these groups. So pretty soon he had 1,100 non-believers in these groups, or all around the community. And we tracked them over a period of years. And we found out that if a non-believer joined a group and stayed in it, 80% came to faith in Christ. Where do you get an 80% conversion rate? It's unbelievable. And young people love these groups because they love to talk. They love to express why they believe what they believe. And we actually teach the leaders of those groups how not to answer questions. Because as you said earlier, sometimes the worst people are the apologists. It's like, why does a loving God allow suffering? Oh, let me give you a 5-point sermon on that. No. We want to ask follow-up questions. Why are you asking that question? What is the reason behind it? What's the psychological or emotional thing that's driving your disbelief and so forth? So we actually teach them to ask more questions. And I'm telling you, these groups are dynamite, absolutely dynamite. And just as a tip to pastors and church leaders, if you want to learn how can we do this, I'll give you 2 quick ways to learn how your church can inaugurate these groups. There's an organization in Wheaton, Illinois called Q Place. That's their ministry. They train people. That's their ministry, or small groups for non-believers. We call them spiritual discovery groups. And then Gary wrote a book on it. It's called Seeker Small Groups. And you get that off Amazon, A to Z, on how to start that ministry in your church.
We'll put that in our show notes, both of those.
Great.
And, I hear you say that, and if I'm sitting in a car right now at a stoplight, or I am in my kitchen and I'm doing dishes and I'm listening to this, my heart would be beating faster thinking, oh, I've got so many non-Christians on our street.
Yes.
What if we just had a study for them to come together, just a time of fellowship, and call it whatever you want.
Dave, this is exactly what my wife did. My wife is an introvert. She's not an evangelist by nature. But she said, I'm going to start a group in my house. She went around the neighborhood to all her friends and said, hey, on Tuesday afternoons at 2 o'clock while the kids are in school, or 1 o'clock, whatever it was, I'm going to have a little thing in my house. We're going to talk about the Bible. Every single person she asked said, yes, I want to be part of that. And so they all came together, and they just went through an evangelistic Bible study together. But nobody ever turned her down. Why? Because they were her friends, and they knew she wasn't going to invite him into something where they're going to be embarrassed or uncomfortable. They trusted her. And when you said that, how many people on our streets are not believers that you could easily invite into a thing like this? And so we have at our church, a lot of these groups going on in neighborhoods with people who've never come to our church. They don't come to our church till they come to faith. And then it's like, oh, gosh, I think I should go to a church.
Yeah. I need to get involved in a church.
Exactly. But, isn't it great that they're meeting in Starbucks or meeting in homes or meeting all around the community during the week?
It's funny, the similarities, because as you're talking, your wife is like my wife. And not only have you and I both had speeding tickets in Kokomo, Indiana on Highway 31, but in addition, our wives are introverts, and they would both say, oh, I don't have the gift of evangelism. Right. I do not have that gift. But there was a stretch for 4 straight years where my wife would have a ladies' Bible study, and at the start of the summer, she didn't have anybody in it. And I'd say, well, who are you going to ask? She said, I'm getting a whole new group. I'm just going to pray that God will cross my path. And her shopping ministry of all the different places that she would go, wherever she would be, sometimes she'd strike up a conversation with someone, and it wasn't to ask them in the Bible study. She'd just say, oh, I love your hair. Where'd you get your hair cut? Yeah. Can I take a picture of it? I've got so many pictures on her phone and on my phone, because it goes to mine too, of these ladies' hair. Well, who is this? Oh, I like your hair. She was in aisle 3, So she'll end up...
That's a great way to get into a conversation. I love that.
She will end up asking them to come and be in her Bible study. Or she'll get their phone number, and they're new to town. They don't know anybody. And it's amazing how God will just take the kind spirit of Leslie or of Beth. And when people see someone being Jesus to them, they might not want to be in a Bible study, but they want to be around that person.
That's right. And they learn to trust them. And if they invite me over to their house for a get-together like that or whatever, I trust them. Yeah, I like this person.
I need to get to know some people, too.
Yeah, true. People are looking for relationships.
While you were speaking, I wrote all these notes down, even though they're all going to be in our show notes. I wrote them down because I just wanted to, the blueberry muffin. That's just great. You can see that happening. But he's earned the right to be heard.
Yes. I call it strategic consumerism. My wife and I do this because I shouldn't say this publicly. My wife is not a very good cook, and so we go out and
we can edit that out.
But we go out to lunch every single day. Little diners, little restaurants, but we do it strategically to make friends and contacts with the waiters and the waitresses and the cooks and the managers and so forth. And that's one of our ministries. And if you go back to the same restaurants and the same bakery and the same gas station and so forth, you can build these little informal friendships. And then when Easter comes around, say, by the way, you going anywhere for church at Easter? Well, no, I usually don't go to church. Well, golly, why don't you join us? Why don't you come with us this Easter? All of a sudden, it becomes easy to make that invitation.
Well, I'm pulling my phone out because this is just filled with nothing but names. And it's all names of, there's all the bank people.
Yep, there you go.
There's where my wife gets her pedicure. There's Core Life restaurant. This is every work at the dentist's office. Rental car places. That's every person at United. I've got 35 names for Delta. And I didn't think this was that important until I started inviting these people to come to Easter services. And it's great we're having this conversation now. I would give Christmas cards to every post office employee that worked at the post office, and I learned every one of their names, and there's a bunch of them in there. And they never commented on it, but one time I'd bought some stamps. I was out in the other room, and someone said, "Oh, do you go to Southeast?" And I said, "No. What do you mean?" And said, "Well, you were talking to Dave. He's our pastor. And you've got his Christmas card up in your station." He said, "Well, he was the only person that sent us a Christmas card last year, so I keep it up here." And so they say he knows every one of our names. And So then leverage that, and I invite them to come to church, and it's the easiest yes that I will get.
Exactly.
And they will share prayer requests with me.
Yep.
And they will tell me, they'll say, I'm not a church-going person, John, you got cancer, but would you pray for me, Pastor?
The first person I think of when a crisis comes up. I wrote a little book once called The Case for Easter. And you get online for I get a discount for $1.50 or whatever. And I always buy a 10-pack every leading up to Easter.
I'm glad you didn't say a 6-pack. You scared me for a second.
And my goal is to give them all away. And so I'll leave a nice tip at a restaurant and then a copy of the book. And we have little cards from our church that have the church times and everything and include that. And it's just something I give away to be a little connection with people.
Yeah.
So
powerful.
It is powerful. People want to be known. That people are hungry for friendships these days. Yeah, we have the internet. Yeah, we've got email. Yeah, we've got all this social media stuff. Do we really have friends anymore? And when somebody's personable to them in an in-person way, golly, that goes a long way toward building a bridge.
The bar is set so low that if you just take an interest in someone, all of a sudden you've got their attention. Yep. I remember you sharing about that point person.
Yeah.
And I think you helped a church in Louisiana.
Yeah.
A smaller church. Tell some of the things that happened. It was a unique setting. It's a great story.
It was. I was giving a talk on this 6-stage process, and one of the people in the audience was a guy named Willie Roberston, who is from Duck Dynasty.
Yes.
And I knew Willie a little bit. We'd met a couple of times. And so he got so excited about this. He went to his pastor, a little church in West Monroe, Louisiana, and said, I want to be the evangelism point person as a volunteer for this church. And the pastor said, great, fantastic. So that's what he did. So he began to build a team and to share evangelistic opportunities and outreaches. And he would send me these texts. As just baptized 30 more people. This is so much fun.
Wow.
In fact, I got one once. He said, we baptized, this was in March of that year, it's a couple of years ago. He said, it's only March. We've already baptized more people than we did all of last year.
Really?
And we're so excited. And then there was a pause, maybe a 20-minute pause, and another email came and said, just baptized 2 more.
Unbelievable.
And he said, this is so much fun. So,
But it's that passion.
It's that passion, exactly. Somebody, and he loves people. He loves seeing people come to faith in Christ. And I just thought, this is great. As a volunteer, he's leading that operation church because the senior pastor can't do all that stuff. We need the help of people like that in our church.
I love that. There are people listening right now. Here we are on the crest of Easter coming.
Yeah.
I know that there are people who come at Easter time who don't believe in the resurrection of Christ.
Yes.
And to think in our Bible studies leading up to Easter, or in our conversations, or our invitation opportunities that we have, or in a sermon we're going to preach, or a lesson that we're going to teach, we have this opportunity to talk to people who will never hear this ever again.
Yeah.
Well, what do you say to those people? What are the things that you want to drive home as far as the resurrection? Because really Christianity rises or falls on the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
It does.
I mean, if Christ did not come back, we're fools.
Our faith is futile. We're still in our sins, according to Paul. And, what I like to say is, Jesus said in John 10, verse 30, I and the Father are one. And the Greek word for one there is not masculine, it's neuter, which means he wasn't saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature. We're one in essence. And the audience understood what he was saying. They picked up stones to kill him because they said, you're just a man. You're claiming to be God. So Jesus claimed to be God, but so what? I could claim to be God. Anybody could claim to be God. But if Jesus claimed to be God, died, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, that's pretty good evidence he's telling the truth. So I'll often use that as a way to kind of get into why should I care about the resurrection? Oh, this is kind of the ultimate proof that Jesus is who he claimed to be, the unique Son of God. And often I'll just use 4 words that begin with the letter E to summarize the evidence for the resurrection. The first E is for execution, that Jesus was truly dead. And there's no dispute about that. Even the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus and said, quote, clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. So clearly Jesus was executed. He was dead. Second E is early. early accounts, early reports of the resurrection. In other words, I used to think when I was an atheist that, okay, I got to give you the fact Jesus was dead, but clearly the resurrection's a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world. So I figured 100, 150, 200 years after the life of Jesus, stories were invented, legends were spun, and that's where the idea of the resurrection came from. But we have, and a lot of people don't know this, we have preserved for us a report of the resurrection of Jesus Christ in the form of a creed of the earliest church. In other words, right there in the first century, the first Christians got together and said, based on what they knew to be true, they formulated a creed that says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the third day, he rose from the dead. And then it mentions the specific names of witnesses and groups of eyewitnesses to whom he appeared. So the Apostle Paul preserved this for us. He wrote it in the church, a letter in the church to Corinth. We call it 1 Corinthians chapter 15, starting at verse 3, is this creed of the church. And what's important about this creed is how immediately it developed after the death of Jesus. Remember we said it took time for legend to develop. We can date this creed. How? Because we know that Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul the Apostle, was an enemy of Christians 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus. He's on the road to Damascus. Boom, he has an encounter with the risen Christ. He becomes the Apostle Paul. Immediately he goes into Damascus and he meets with some apostles. Many scholars believe this is when he was given this creed that he later gave to the church in Corinth. Some are more skeptical and say it may have been 3 years later. 3 years later, Paul gets together in Jerusalem with 2 eyewitnesses to the resurrection who are named in the creed, Peter and James. And the Greek word in Galatians he uses to describe this meeting suggests this was an investigative meeting. They're checking each other out. What do you know? What did you see? What did you experience? Really? Other scholars think this is when he was given the creed by 2 people named in the creed. But either way, this means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed is already in existence. Therefore, the beliefs that make up that creed go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself. In fact, one of the greatest scholars of ancient history in our lifetime, James D.G. Dunn of the United Kingdom, said, this creed, we can be entirely confident, was formulated as a creed within months of the death of Jesus. Wow. So here we have an eyewitness-based report of the resurrection of Jesus dating back within months of his death. This is a news flash from ancient history. This is almost unprecedented in terms of how immediately it developed. And the third E stands for the word empty. We have an empty tomb. And even the enemies of Jesus conceded the tomb was empty. We know from sources inside and outside the Bible that when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the enemies of Jesus said was, the disciples stole the body. Now think about that. They're admitting the tomb is empty. They're trying to explain how it got empty. It's like if you're a teacher and a student comes up to you and says, the dog ate my homework. That student's admitting, I don't have my homework, but I can tell you what happened to it. The dog ate it. It's the same thing. So even the enemies of Jesus are implicitly admitting the tomb was empty. The question is, how did it get empty? That is the question ultimately. Disciples didn't have the motive, the means, or the opportunity to steal the body. I've got 7 ancient sources that say the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen. They had no motive to do that. The Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. The Jewish leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. So, so we got an empty tomb. And then the fourth E is eyewitnesses. Jesus appears alive in a dozen different instances to more than 515 people. To skeptics and doubters, to believers, to men, to women, to groups, to individuals, daytime, nighttime. Disciples talked to him, they touched him, they ate with him. Most of what we believe about the ancient world, when you track it down, it's based on one source or maybe 2 sources of information.
Right.
For the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Jesus. That is an avalanche of historic data. So I'll go through the 9 sources real quick, just so you'll know what they are. Number 1, Paul. Paul was an eyewitness to the resurrected Christ, and he says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 11, whether it's I or they, meaning the disciples, this is what we preach, the resurrection. He's confirming the disciples were eyewitnesses. Second, the creed that I mentioned earlier, powerful bit of historical data. That's the second source. Third source is Peter himself, who gets up at Pentecost and says, this Jesus who God has raised from the dead, to which we're all witnesses. He says he's an eyewitness. Peter's an eyewitness. Then the next four sources are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that are based on eyewitness accounts of the life, teachings, miracles, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And then we have two sources outside the Bible. Because if someone were to sit, Dave, under your teachings at a church for 2 or 3 years, they would have a good idea what you believe.
Sure.
We actually have things written by people who sat under the teachings of the eyewitnesses to the resurrection themselves. Clement and Polycarp sat under the teachings of the disciples. They knew what they talked about, and they wrote letters in which they affirmed that where did the disciples get their courage and so forth? From the resurrection, because it's true, because they're eyewitnesses and so forth. So they confirm that the disciples are eyewitnesses to the resurrection. So those are 9 ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament. And those are 4 easy things to remember. Execution, early accounts, empty tomb, and eyewitnesses that can form a backbone if you're going to give a talk on Easter or if you just want to talk to someone about why you believe what you believe.
Yeah, you say that, and I'm sitting here thinking, wow, if you're preaching this Easter and you're struggling with what to talk about, all you got to do is go back on this podcast to about 10 minutes ago and just put it down to maybe 0.75 speed. And Lee's not going to mind. He wants this word to get out. Yeah. This is all good stuff, and it's verified. This is from a journalist who has studied this thing, and you all have studied it as well yourselves. But what a great outline that is, those 4 E's, and then those 9 proofs. Yeah. It's so strong. So I hope that you'll take advantage of that if you are listening to this right now or watching this. As I'm listening, I'm thinking about how every Christian leader, if you believe in the resurrection, which hopefully every Christian leader who is right now is not in that season of doubt, but has totally embraced the resurrection of Christ, that should motivate us to want to put those invitations out. Easter is a big deal. Yeah. And I've found as a preacher of the gospel that when I have guests with me or when I've invited someone, I preach better. Yeah. And the other thing is, if you are on staff at a church or you're a key volunteer at a church and you have people who are seated beside you and people start to see that as a habit, that you have non-Christians beside you, well, that shows that you practice what you preach and what you teach. Yes. And so you're modeling that.
That value is caught by people. They will pick up on that. Speed of the leader, speed of the team.
I had somebody say to me the other day, how can you believe in a God that exists when you've never seen him? And I said, I believe in Walmart employees.
That's good.
I'm going to jump back in time to 2017 because you had an experience that very few people have, and that is to have your personal testimony, your conversion, put on the big screen. Yeah. Your book, The Case for Christ, came out. And then in 2017, years later, it became a major motion picture. Yeah. I thought Brad Pitt played you well. I can't remember. I don't know. I think he was busy.
It was Mike Vogel, actually.
Yeah, okay. I couldn't remember who it was, but I think Brad was busy. He was doing something else.
We did Faye Dunaway in it, though, for the older folks. I mean, that was huge.
That's right. That's right. What was it like seeing your testimony of faith play out on the big screen?
Well, I'll tell you, they sent an advance copy of the film to Leslie and me to see it. Yeah. And I came home one day, and Leslie was watching it again. And I said, honey, how many times have you watched the movie? And she said, I think 13 times. I said, why do you keep watching it? And she said, I want to get cried out. Because when I see it in public, I don't want to cry and I'll embarrass myself. And then we saw it for the first time in public at a movie theater in Toronto, Canada, and we both cried. Yeah. It's such an accurate film. It's about 85% accurate. There's some time compression and some composite characters, but I mean, there's certain scenes that are almost word for word. And it's our story, so it's very raw, and it brings back memories, some of them not good. Because my wife, when she became a Christian, I was still an adamant atheist. I was angry. I was... It was the most difficult time of our marriage. And so seeing that lived out on the screen has been difficult for that reason, and yet encouraging by the way God has used the film. It's unbelievable. You know, it was on Netflix for 3 years, and people would use it evangelistically. I got friends who to this day, you know, get it on DVD or it's still on one of the major streaming services. I can't think of which one right now, but you can find it out there. It's like there was a there was a church in New Zealand that rented a movie theater, showed it, and 22 people came to faith. The gospel is in it. And
it is.
You know, we did it at church, Bellevue Church, Baptist Church in where's that?
Memphis.
Memphis, yes.
Yeah.
We did it there where Leslie and I came and we invited the community, and then we got interviewed after the film, and we expected 1,000 people to show up. 4,000 people showed up to that.
Really?
So people love movies, and there's an idea for a church. You want an inexpensive outreach? Show the movie. You know, and if I can do it, Leslie and I can zoom in and, you know, at the end of the movie and answer some questions or whatever, if we can work it into our schedule. But just show the movie and then get up afterwards to say, what do you think? Some of you, for the first time, believe. And John 1:12 says, that's great, but we also have to receive. Maybe now's the time. Maybe let me just help you come into the presence of God and receive Jesus as your Lord and Savior. I mean, there's an inexpensive outreach event that any church can do.
Well, you've given us so many great ideas. I want to wrap up by asking you this question, and it might be an unusual question to ask, but I know that there are Christian leaders who we all go through seasons of doubt.
Yeah.
And it's not that we're turning our back on our faith, but it could be circumstances. It might be a season. It might be something that's going on in the life of the church. Maybe it's the way we're being treated by church leaders.
Yeah.
It could be a variety of different reasons. But you just start to kind of lose your faith. And I think Satan can kind of pounce on those seasons.
No question.
And take advantage of those, because if Satan can get us spiraling downward, he knows that he can get us to walk away.
Yeah.
What would you say to the Christian leader who's listening right now, who maybe finds himself in that valley?
I hope every Christian leader has or will develop a close relationship with a Christian brother who they can be honest with and they can sit down with and say, man, I'm struggling. I got to tell you, I'm struggling right now. And they won't freak out and they won't point fingers, but they'll say, yeah, you know what, I went through that a few years ago. Let me help. Let's talk about it. You know, I think one thing to understand, we see this in John the Baptist, you know. If anybody should have known the identity of Jesus being the Son of God, it was John the Baptist, but then he gets thrown in prison. Now he's got doubts. But what does he do? Does he wallow in that? No. He gets a couple friends together, says, go track Jesus down, ask him point blank, are you the one we've been waiting for? Or are we to wait for somebody else? So they go and they track down Jesus. And what does Jesus do? Does he get mad? Does he, how dare John, of all people, how dare John have the temerity to express a hesitation about my... No.
Yeah, if anyone should know.
If anyone should know. No, he says, look, go back to John and tell him what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Go back, tell him about the evidence you've seen that convinces you that I am who I claim to be. And so they go back and they tell John. But it's after this incident that Jesus gets up before a group and he says, among those born of women, there's no one greater than John.
Yeah.
John, the guy who dared to ask a question. So don't feel a sense of shame that, here I am, a church leader, and having these questions or doubts. God is not surprised. You're not keeping it from him. He knows. And so find someone like that. And it's probably someone outside of your church. Who you can build a friendship with, maybe a pastor of another church in another town, who you can just be honest with and talk about these things. And then I always encourage people to say, distill down, what is the sticking point? Get it down on a piece of paper. Here it is. Here are the two things that are really bothering me. Number one, the hiddenness of God. I'm bothered by God. It seems so hidden from me. And number two, why is there so much suffering? I see it in my life and the life of others, or whatever it is. Get it down on paper, because then you can address it. There are books that are written. There's no question you can come up with that there hasn't been a book or a video done by a responsible Christian leader or apologist who doesn't address that thing. So, but sometimes it becomes an amorphous sense of doubt, and it's hard to deal with that. Identify what is the sticking point, and then you can pursue answers that can satisfy your heart and soul. The other thing is, you know what? You can be heaven-bound. You can be a sincere disciple of Jesus and still have some doubts about some aspects of the faith. Now, there are some core beliefs that we have to cling tightly to.
Sure.
But there are some other issues that we're going to have to wait to heaven. I mean, when I get to heaven, I'm going to raise my hand. Jesus, how does this Arminian and Calvinistic thing, how does this fit together? I don't, please, could you explain this thing to me? There are certain side issues that we may never get resolution in this life, and that's okay. We can hold those in tension because we've got at least 20 arrows of evidence that point toward the truth of Christianity. And yes, there are some questions that are a little harder to pin down, but we can hold those in abeyance and someday ask Jesus about them. But it's okay that we have some doubts about peripheral issues. The word denominator, like common denominator, and denomination has the same root. And so if we are a Christian, if we are part of a Christian denomination, we have a common denominator, which is the gospel. Let's cling close to that, the essentials of the faith. And you know what? On some of the peripheral things, it's okay to have differences and questions and some doubts and a little bit of confusion, That's all right. But let's cling tightly to that which we need to know to have a sincere relationship with God and to tell others about Him.
Yeah. Well said, and you have bolstered our faith today. You really have.
Thanks.
You've got us excited about Easter. Lee's newest book, Seeing the Supernatural, just came out. It's got that chapter on Easter. It also has a lot of different things on near-death experiences, talking about ghosts as well. He tackles some really tough topics. Yeah. I can't wait to read it. You have been an incredible guest, and we appreciate the way your life has been a living testimony for Christ. I just want to say this. It goes beyond what you do on the big scope of things. Movies, large churches, all the books. It goes beyond that. It's what you and Leslie do intentionally at lunch. It's all those little things and what I've seen you live out. So I call it the unexpected adventure.
If you follow Christ, you never know what's going to happen, what opportunities will come about.
I agree with that. But your life is an expression that you believe in the resurrection of Christ, and you want other people to believe that too.
Thank you.
So thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Dave. God bless you, man.
Thank you. I told you, fasten your seatbelt. I mean, when you listen to Lee Strobel, it's like drinking from a fire hydrant, and everything he says is so good. I'm writing notes as fast as I possibly can. Here's some takeaways that I had. Proverbs 27:17 as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another, and he sharpened our hearts today. Revelation 12:11, and they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And that's the disciples' story. They were martyrs for the faith. They were so convinced in the resurrection of Jesus Christ that they were willing to die for it. I also love the part where Lee talked about doubts. And I think that's so important because we do go through those seasons. Someone said if you've never had a question or a doubt about your faith, then you probably don't have much of a faith. And we all go through some of those seasons where we start to question some things. And I hope that dives us deeper into study. And as Lee said, I hope that we talk about it with some others, because usually all we need is a trusted Christian friend who will help us through, and they'll tell us a little bit about some of the times when maybe they struggled. I think my favorite takeaway or greatest takeaway from today was Lee's passion for evangelism. I can find that the longer I'm in leadership and in ministry, the longer I live in church world and I get my paycheck from a church, it becomes easier for the old story to become just that, the old story. How can a resurrection become routine? Well, it shouldn't, and we can't let it. And especially at this time of year with Easter coming up, man, I just want to challenge you to be praying, to be inviting people. People are open to the gospel. I've heard of studies that say that somewhere around 50% of the time, if you invite someone to an Easter or Christmas service, they will come. They just are waiting to be asked because they know they're supposed to do something spiritual around one of those holidays. It reminds me of one of my favorite stories. A couple was shopping in a large clothing store, and they had their 5-year-old son with them. And after a few minutes, the parents each got a little bit more interested in the clothing than they did keeping an eye on their 5-year-old. And after several minutes of them each thinking that the other parent was watching him, they realized that neither of them had been watching him. So they started spreading out and looking. And when it hit about the 10-minute mark and they hadn't found him, they got everyone else involved. And store clerks and different employees were involved, and everyone was looking. It hit about the 15-minute mark, and the mom got this sick feeling in her heart, like I might never see my son again, and he's been abducted. But about that same time, over the loudspeaker, a voice said, "Would Mr. and Mrs. Bernard Johnson please report to the manager's office on the second level?" And they both went bounding up the escalator, and they found the manager's office, and they threw open the door, and there, seated back behind the manager's desk, with his feet propped up, sipping on a ice-cold Coke, was their 5-year-old son, having the time of his life. But when the little boy saw the worried and frantic expression on his parents' faces, his smile immediately gave way, and he burst into tears. Do you realize why? He had no idea he was lost until he was found. And that is precisely the same spiritual condition that many people are in who will darken the doorway of your church this Easter. They just don't have a clue. They don't have any idea that they're lost until someday they're found. And Easter could be the start of that journey for them. So please, don't let this story of the resurrection become routine. Invite and preach like eternity depends on it, because it does. Pray and teach like this really matters, because it does. And make this an Easter that changes the family tree for someone whom you invite. Well, I want you to know that this is something that is important for you to join us on this journey each and every week. And a huge part of what we hope to accomplish with this podcast is to equip you both personally and professionally. And one way that we do that is through the focusedpastor.org. When you create a free Focused Pastor account, you gain exclusive access to free resources such as small group studies, video curriculum, and a library of free ebooks. Plus, we give you 50% off of everything in the Focused Pastor store. So sign up, head over to thefocusedpastor.org, or click the link below in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining us on this journey. You know that every Tuesday we drop a brand new conversation on Pastor to Pastor. It's designed to encourage, inspire, and challenge you. And if you found this episode helpful, please pass it on to your friends. You can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts or on YouTube at the Focused Pastor channel. Leadership can be lonely, but rest assured, you're not alone. So until next time, I'm Dave Stone. God bless.